Hello friends, welcome back to the session. So in this session, we will discuss about the buffer or the cache memory, or also we can call it as a buffering database table. As we know, we do have the three-tier architecture. We do have presentation, we do have application, and we do have database server. In real time, we can have multiple presentation server. We can also have the multiple application server. It doesn't mean that you do have the multiple, but it sometimes you can have single also, but you can have multiple application server also. And we do have the single database server. So what is the scenario behind in what cases we do have the multiple application server? Suppose if the industry is a large scale and if you do have the large base customers, and in that situations you do have the large base applications to run on the applications or the servers, in that situation we need to balance the load. For that reason we can have the multiple application, but it doesn't mean that you do always have the multiple. It can also have the single also, but there is no any specific count. You can have one, you can have the multiple. But if you look at the architecture of three SAP, you do have presentation, application, and the database. But it can have the multiple presentation application, but database is always only one. And the major focus is towards on the load. So it doesn't mean that if you are visiting the database again and again, it might issue, like it might cause us a load on the database. If you are increasing the traffic on the database, it might be the performance issue. See, whenever we as a abapper, if you are developing any applications, if you are developing any programs, tables, anything, of course, the executions process is what? Every request will go to the application. From there, it will go to the database. Database will respond back to the application. From there, it will come to the. This is the procedure goes on. So along with the execution, so what application you have developed, what results you are getting based on the input, that is one end. Of course, you are getting the proper result. That is also fine. But along with that, we also need to take care about the performance. Does your program is really behaving good, or it taking a longer time to get the result? That is a part of performance. There are many reasons to improve the performance of a program. So one of the reason is the load. If you are increasing the load on the database, that also might cause a major issue on the performance. Now, what measures we to take to improve the performance? What measures we should take to avoid visiting the database again and again? Visiting the database again and again, or we can say the frequently, that also cause a performance issue. Now, what improvement or what measures we should take to improve the performance of a program? Now, for example, I do have a table, or you have developed one program. In that background, it is executing or it is hitting the same table. Now, for example, if I'm working with any table or the program, so whenever I execute that table or whenever I execute that program, the request will go to the application. In the application, we do have the DB or R3 interface, as we already discussed during the OpenSQL statement. So it will connect to the DB interface if the statement is related to, suppose if you are executing any select statement which is hitting the database table in the background. So the same request will comes to the database, right? Now database will respond back with the data. Again, that request comes through the application, and from there it will come to the presentation. If you are running this for the first time, then it is absolutely fine. But the issue where it comes, if you are hitting the same database table again and again, or we can say frequently. Let's assume in a day, like multiple times you are working with the same database table. That might be a chances you are working with the same table and multiple times it is hitting the same table by manually or by through any programs. Does it mean every time you're going to the database? No. If you're visiting the database again and again with the same request, of course it will increase the load on the database. Then what is the alternative solution for this? So then we come across with the concept called buffer or the cache memory. So buffer or the cache memory, it is a temporary memory. It is a temporary memory created in a RAM of application server. A RAM of application server to hold the data temporarily. And what is the major advantage? Why should go with the buffer? The main advantage is to improve the performance. Improve the performance. Now, how it going to help you to improve the performance? Now, if you are working with any table, as we discussed, every time it will go to the database and the database will respond back to the presentation via always application server. Now, if you are working or if you are reading the data frequently from any specific database table, then we are going to enable the buffer of that table. That's the reason we discuss buffering database table. It will always on the table specific. It doesn't mean that if you enable the buffer in that common buffer, you are going to store the data from multiple tables. No. Suppose you do have three tables, A, B, C. Let's assume you do have three tables, A, B, C. Now, if you enable the buffer of table A, so I have created the buffer of table A, and after some time, you are enabling the buffer of table B also. It doesn't mean it's going to have the common buffer. No. Again, it's going to create the separate buffer for the B table. Means it will be having the individual buffer. Now, where this buffer is going to be created? So, buffer will be created in RAM of application server. The buffer will be created in RAM of application server. That is a part of top of database tables. Now, what is the use of this buffer? Now, once we enable or once we activate the buffer or any specific database table, it will create a temporary memory in the application server. Now, what is going to be happen? Now, suppose again I'm running the same table for the table which I have activated the buffer. So, as like earlier, again we're going to request it will go to the DB interface. Now, with the DB interface, we will get to know that either the buffer is enabled for the database table or not. Okay, so with this DB buffer, he get to know that buffer is activated. Now he will check the requested data does exist in the buffer or not. Of course, very first time you don't have the data in the buffer. Now what it happen? The same request will go to the database again. Now what this time database is going to do? Database is again going to respond back to the application server, but the request directly never go to the presentation. Instead, it will respond back to the buffer. The requested data will be copied. The requested data will be updated. I can say copy. The data which has requested by the database table, that data will get copied in the buffer memory. And from here, the request will goes back to the presentation. So this is how the data will request back to the presentation. Now suppose after few time, like in next 1 hour, in next 30 minutes, you are executing the same table or maybe the same program which is hitting the same table in the background. Now again the request will go to the application. Now he will check with the DB interface, either buffer is enabled for the specific table or not. Now, of course, he will get to know that buffer is activated, so it will go to the buffer memory. He will check either requested data does exist in the table. Of course, yes, available. So it will be response back to the presentation. So this time we have avoided to visit the database again. Now you can think that suppose in meantime, so I have executed this table or the program right away, and after 30 minutes or maybe in next 1 hour, I'm going to execute the same table. Does it mean it going to the database? Of course, no, it will request back from the buffer itself. Now, in that time gap, like you have executed the report 1 hour back, and in that meantime, someone through program, they have updated some data at the database level. They have changed some entry. I'm not talking about the new entry, I'm talking about existing entry. They have done some modification to the existing entry at the database level. You do have some set of data in the database table. Through any other program, someone has modified the entry from your database table. Now the request you are giving from the presentation, which is accessing the buffer, now buffer will return you the obsolete data. The data which is outdated means it contains the previous data, invalidated data. Then how need to be sure like I do have the accurate data? You know, someone else, if your buffer is activated and someone else from the background through program if he is updating any entry from your table for the table which buffer is activated. In that situation, there is a table called ddlog. There is a table called ddlog. This table contains the log through program the table is updated or modified, right? Now what system will do? Now here the buffer synchronization comes to picture. This table is itself a buffer synchronization. The dd log is itself a part of buffer synchronization. Now what it going to do? Now in that time gap, someone else from the background, they did triggered your table, they have modified the entry from your table. Now how need to be sure that my buffer contains that updated data? See, there is a time gap around 1 to 2 minutes, or I can say 60 to 120 seconds. Now suppose just 2 minutes back you have executed the table and from the buffer you have received the result. Now in that time gap, someone has through program, they modified the entry from the database table. It does again at the third minute, you are executing the same table means your buffer contains some invalidated data. Absolute data means you don't have the recent the data which has been changed through the different program. Then how need to be sure your program like you are getting the correct results? So whenever someone else through program, if they modify the table for which the buffer is activated, so then that situation it will create a entry in a table called ddlog, that table itself as a buffer synchronization. And at every time gap between 1 to 2 minutes, so this buffer synchronization is going to be take place. Now what it going to do? So what it going to do? It will read the data from ddlog. Do you have any logs against this table? Of course, yes. Just 1 minute back, someone has updated the table. Then what it will do? It will go to the database. It will bring the data from the database and it will update the buffer. Now your buffer contains the updated data after 2 minutes. Now let's assume now time is 12:04. Okay, let's assume you have executed this table, you have received the output. Now your output is correct. And immediately at 12:05, someone has from the background through program, they have updated the table entries. Now your table contains the updated entry, but the output which you have received, that output you have received from the buffer. Now buffer is invalidated, means it contains some obsolete data because at 12:05 someone has updated the table entries. I'm not talking about new entry, I'm talking about entries which has been updated through program. Now how you need to be sure that your buffer contains the valid data? Okay, so whenever between this time gap, I'm not saying that immediately after 12:05 at 55 seconds you are executing the report. I'm taking at least for 1 to 2 minutes time, maximum 2 minutes time. Suppose if you're running the same report at 12:07, then what system will do? So the request come to the DB buffer. Now what DB buffer will do? Of course, that will get to know that either your buffer is activated or not. Of course, your buffer is activated. Before that, it will read the logs from the DD log. And he will check recently if someone has modified the table entries. Of course, at 12:05, someone has modified and buffer contains the isolated data, invalidated data, obsolete data, I can say. Now what it will do? The same request will go to the database. It will read the data, including the updated one, and then it will update the buffer. And then it's going to be response back. And this is an automatic job going to be triggered by the system itself. Buffer synchronization. It's going to be triggered at every 1 to 2 minutes or maximum time limit you can consider as a 2 minute. If someone has updated the table through program, then it will going to create the logs in DD log. And every request, so whenever you do the request from the presentation server through DB interface, if the buffer is activated, he will check the logs from the DD log. If recently anything changes happen to the table, if yes, then he will compare by reading the data from the database and from the buffer. Then if it is a mismatch, then it will be overwrite with the new entry which has been received, or I can say update the buffer from the new entries. Now your buffer contains the accurate data, the recent, the change updated data. Now it's going to be response back. So this is going to be at the table level. As I discussed, suppose I do have three tables, A, B, C. Now, if you have enabled the table, you have enabled the buffer for table A. It means the buffer memory has been created, and after some times you are going to enable the buffer for table B. It doesn't mean that it's going to be have the common memory. No, table A, the different memory, table B is a separate memory. So buffer is going to be enabled and it will always work on the table specific. So it is to just the buffer is going to be enabled. Now you can ask me in what scenario we need to work with the buffer. Is it something like whenever we create a new table, we always activate the buffer? No. You are going to work with the buffer only when if you are accessing the table frequently. This is one scenario, and you can activate the buffer only when if you have the less amount of data. And you also need to be make sure that the table is going to be changed very rarely. You are updating, you are accessing the table entries. You are updating the table entries very rarely. If there is a frequent changes, like in a day you are multiple times you are updating the table, then there is no any makes sense to work with the buffer, because as I discussed, the buffer log, the buffering synchronization, these other things is going to be taken place in the background. Maybe your buffer is not going to have the valid data, invalid or obsolete data, I can say. So makes sense to work with the buffer only when if you're accessing the table very rarely or not. I can say you are, of course, buffer will be activated only when if you're accessing the table frequently. But you also be make sure that you are updating the table very rarely. You're not keep on updating the same table again and again. For example, if you look at T001, it contains some company code related information. So once we create it, we cannot change it frequently or we cannot update this frequently. Once it is created, so on, it will go live, means long away. In that situation, makes sense to activate the buffer for this table. Maybe you're accessing this table frequently, but you're not updating frequently. Very rarely you're updating. Then it is a makes sense to work with the buffer. Now, does it mean whenever we create the table, we must activate the buffer? No. That is, you do have the requirement from the user department, like this table is being accessed frequently and it contains some very rare data. And also we have taken care like we are updating this table very rarely. So please enable the buffer. So by default, whenever we create a table, buffer will not be activated or not enabled. Now, suppose what if I want to activate the buffer, then you need to work with the buffering option. There is a concept called buffering option. So we do have three buffering options. One with buffering not allowed. So by default, this option is selected, buffering not allowed. It means your buffer is inactivated. Whatever the data you are extracting from the database, it will not be stored in buffer. The buffer is not active. If your buffer is not active, the data which you are accessing, requesting or extracting from the database will not be stored in buffer. Next comes with buffering allowed but switched off. Buffering allowed but switched off. So we are working with this option very rarely. It means the data which you are extracting from the database, it will be copied or stored in a buffer, but access is restricted. The data will be stored in buffer, but access is restricted. The third comes with buffering activated, or you can say buffering allowed, or you can say buffering switched on. So based on the requirement from the user department, we are going to work with the third option, buffering activated. What it happened in this case, the data will be stored in buffer, and anybody can access it. The data will be stored in buffer, anybody can activate it. Now, by default, the first option will be selected. So whenever you create the table, by default, first option will be selected. Now, if you select either buffering allowed but switched off or buffering activated, then only the buffering types comes to the picture. You do have buffering types again. The first one is single record buffer. Single record buffer. Now, for example, let's take a scenario. If I will go with any of the existing table, for example, so this is my one of the table. If I click on display, if I go with the table content, execute. So these are the some set of entries. These are the some set of entries. Now, if I select the single record buffer, if our buffer is enabled, now your buffer is enabled, and if I am reading all the data from the database, now if I execute any select statement, he is fetching all the data from the database. Now, among those data, suppose you do have 10 rows. You are extracting the data from the database through select statement, and the system has extracted 10 record from the database. But among those 10 record, only first row will be stored in buffer. Now, for example, if I go with any either custom table or standard table. Okay, so if I execute any select statement, suppose I'm extracting around 200 entry from the database. I'm extracting around 200 entry from the database. Among these 200 entries, it will only first row will be stored in a buffer, not all. Only first row, remaining 199 will be not be stored in the buffer. However, you'll get the result in the presentation, but I'm talking about the storing of data in a buffer. Only first row, like the first row is something like TK5000R25. Only this row will be stored in a buffer. That's a part of single record. So here I can say only first row, or I can say single row data will be stored in buffer. Second comes with fully buffered. Of course, all the data. All the data which you are requesting from the database will be stored in a buffer. All the data will be stored in buffer. The third one comes with generic area. The generic area is nothing but the key field data. The key field data will be called as generic area. So only key field data will be stored in buffer. Only key field data will be stored in buffer. Now, for example, can you see you do have the multiple rows over here? As I discussed, single record buffer means even though if you are extracting all 200 entry from the database, only first row will be stored in a buffer. If I go with the fully buffered, all the row plus all the column, which are all the row you are extracting from the database, it will be stored in a buffer. When I talk about the generic area, only key field. Now in this, these are the only two key fields. Somewhat vendor and the client. These are only the two key fields, rest of the non-key field. Only key column information will be stored in a buffer. That is a part of generic area. So now where I can find this buffering options or buffering related to the settings. So go to SE11. So this is a table which we have created in a previous session. So just if I want to maintain the settings related to the buffering, after you need to go with the change option. So I'm going to select in the change option under technical settings. So under this data class size category, you can find the buffering option. So by default, buffering not allowed is selected. Now, if you want to if you want to activate the buffer and if you want to store the data, then you need to select any one of these two options. Buffering allowed was switched off, but there is some restriction with this. So if you want to open for all, then you need to select with the buffering activated, or some system you can find it as a buffering switch on also. Now, after that, we do have the buffering types. Now, buffering types comes to picture only when if you select any one of these options, buffering allowed but switched off or buffering activated, right? Now, apart from this, we do have two more things. One with displacement and second one is resetting the table buffer. We will see followed by this. Now, what is the meaning of displacement? Suppose the buffer which you have created, now you required some more space in the buffer for the new data. Then the data which has not been accessed at the longest time, such data will be displaced. Now, what is the meaning of displacement? You're forcing to leave. Means forcefully the data will be removed. So that is a part of displacement. Now here, if the more space required in the buffer for the new data, then the data which has not been accessed at longest will be displaced. Means you are forcing or you are forcefully removing that data. That is a part of displacement. Next comes with resetting the table buffer. As name itself specifies, as you can reset the table buffer which has been created in the application server. Now when we are going to reset, suppose if there is any inconsistency in the buffer, in that situation you need to reset. Now for example, in your device, if you're feeling some uneasy in the device, it is not responding you properly, what you can do? Immediately you restart the system or restart the mobile phone. In the same way, you need to reset the buffer in certain situation when you're finding the inconsistency in the buffer. Again, if you're doing this job, it will take a longer time also, longer hours I can say. In that situation, it will impact on the performance, right? So here I can say you can reset on the application server. Now how to reset? By using command called tap in the command line. The command line is what? The T code which you are going to be passed. That is a part of command line. So that's it for the buffer. Thank you for the day. Thank you for the session.